Thank you. So many of you from whom I've spoken to here at least said that you're already familiar with the American Colonel Douglas Macgregor. And again, besides his very extensive military background in leading troops on the battlefield, he also has a strong political background and written a multitude of books on military strategy. I tried to introduce him as an intellectual one when he pushed back on it. I don't know why, but I think so at least. Anyways, this has made him a very attractive analyst on both the Ukraine war, but also the war in Gaza, which is now expanding across the Middle East, which he has been very critical about. So we're meeting here today to discuss primarily the media's role in this war. So I thought he's a great source for explaining what's actually been happening on the ground vis-a-vis what the media has actually been reporting. So I thought we could start with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what's been happening on the battlefield, because initially there was great optimism in NATO. We were told, you know, the Russians were attempting to conquer all of Ukraine before they were pushed out of Kiev, and then, of course, they were defeated in Kharkov and Kherson, and this, you know, Russia was supposed to be on its last foot. I was wondering how you assess that information or narrative.
Well, good afternoon. It's still morning here, so you'll excuse me if I periodically drink coffee, although I see that many in the audience are imbibing heavily. I thought the Finns were the big coffee drinkers, but I guess the Norwegians are too. First, let's understand something, that historically in the United States, our principal interest, at least until 1917, when we imprudently involved ourselves in the First World War, was peace, stability, and prosperity at home as well as abroad. This meant that our interests were largely in commercial activity and good relations with everyone. This began changing in 1917. Our experience with the First World War was so horrific that Americans almost universally decided we don't ever want to do this again. And so it took President Roosevelt and his substantial efforts to bring on a war with the Japanese to drag us into World War II. After World War II, we became entangled in European and world affairs because, frankly, of our strategic failures during the Second World War to bring that war to a successful close. Ultimately, communism won the war. This compelled us to stay in Central Europe and around the world to deal with communism. Communism finally left the stage, at least in a formal sense, and in 1991, 92, 93, people began to celebrate the fact that we could reduce our investment in military spending and we no longer had to become involved everywhere. This was rapidly turned around, as most of you know, by the Clinton administration, and we began again the process of meddling in the internal affairs of others that continues up to the present time. Now, why do I say this? Because historically, we have no strategic interest in Ukraine. We certainly have no strategic interest in Eastern Ukraine. And with the fall of communism, we have no interest in hostility with Russia. And we do not regard Russia normally as an enemy. But we have become a victim of the narrative. And your previous speaker was very eloquent when he pointed out that we have a narrative for everything, but we don't have any truth. And so begins America's war against Russia in Ukraine. No, history did not begin on the 22nd of February, 2022. And I don't want to spend, time as Vladimir Putin did on 1,000 years of history. And I think most of his history is probably accurate, except for his failure to admit that without communism, we wouldn't have had a Second World War. We certainly probably wouldn't have had an Adolf Hitler. And that is really disturbing because of the role that communism played in bringing on that war was terrible. They paid a horrendous price for it, but it would be better for the Russians if he admitted to it. Vladimir Putin today, however, is very different from his Soviet predecessors, and I would argue even his Tsarist predecessors, because he's adopted a position very similar to Americans before World War I, and that is that the business of Russia is not expansion. The business of Russia is not war against its neighbors. Certainly the Russians want to be secure, but the Russians want to do business. And that is their focus. And they would like to do business with everyone, including us. We have taken a different position. We have decided to demonize them and characterize anything they do as evil and richly deserving of the contempt and hostility of the entire world. I think it's wrong. And it's put us in a very difficult position because we have lost the war in Ukraine. We have poured billions and billions of dollars of equipment and assistance and support into the country. And this money is overwhelmingly lost. A lot of it has been stolen, as much of the equipment has. We are now finding equipment that we sold through the defense establishments and our industries to Congress that then transfers this equipment to Ukraine, only to find that it shows up in the hands of Mexican drug cartels. So Ukraine has become a marvelous international weapons bazaar that helps and serves the interests of everyone but the United States, and I would argue the West. We have one interest at this point, one sole strategic interest, in my judgment, and that is to bring this war to a rapid close. That means coming to the negotiating table without preconditions and looking at the world as it is, not as we would like it to be. Unfortunately, that departure from fantasy is not popular in the West because the same people who want war seem to control not only the financial markets and the media, they control our government, and I would argue they control most of your governments. And they want war with Russia. This has been devastating for us economically, devastating for you. And I think we're seeing a new block of nations emerge, a return to something like the gold standard for at least 80 of the countries in the world eventually, certainly begun with BRICS, but now spreading rapidly. And everyone is trying to get out from under the American financial system because our policies of bribing, brutalizing, bullying, sanctioning, and bombing are things that most of the world wants nothing to do with. But this false sense of moral righteousness, of moral superiority, animates too much of what happens in Washington. And I found it very interesting in your previous speaker, he put up the picture of the Ottoman Empire, then he showed you the distributions of population and pointed out that NATO had failed to even address these things. I personally think that all of these alliances are outdated and unneeded. I'm a firm believer in what I call agreements or partnerships of limited liability. I think most states most of the time can get along. But if you ally yourselves as we have and then demand that your partners hate in the plural and hate in unison, and then at the same time ignore injustice and moral decadence, then I think you're in a lot of trouble. I think we're in a lot of trouble right now. We want to be on the side of right, but we clearly are not. We're hypocrites. We don't like to admit it. And I think it's time to understand that we cannot fix everything in the world that's wrong, but we certainly have no obligation to support anything that is wrong if we judge it to be morally wrong or simply not in our interests or antithetical to our strategic interests. I don't think 32 nations can agree on very much most of the time, which is one of the reasons I thought NATO expansion was a serious mistake. Well, that damage is done, and I think NATO will not last much longer after this war comes to an end.
You spoke about narratives, and I was curious because it seems at the moment the key narrative going is that of a stalemate. That is, Ukraine can still win this thing if we just send a little bit more weapons, a few more F-16s. And I was just wondering, how do you see this? The main argument is that the territory hasn't shifted greatly. How would you analyze or assess the direction of the war?
Well, like everything else, these narratives rest on a foundation of pure fiction. They're just lies. Over 500,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died in this war. When I began citing these casualty figures as they mounted up, based on my sources on the ground in Ukraine, Poland, and Russia, as well as in other parts of Eastern Europe, I was violently attacked. That's wrong. The Russians are taking heavy casualties. They're the ones who are losing. Well, the Russians have only rarely taken heavy casualties. By the way, this recent fight for Avdiivka cost the Russians 7,000 dead over a period of many weeks. It was a very tough fight. But in most cases, their casualties have been extremely light because they have moved into a strategic defense, and they have discovered how to link massive standoff firepower to overhead intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms. These make the fire very precise and devastating. They have also managed to neutralize our efforts from overhead surveillance and from offshore surveillance to help the Ukrainians to the point where the Ukrainian military has been devastated. At this point, even if they were to go into the country in the West and dredge up anybody they could find who was even remotely capable of carrying a weapon, they would be lucky to find 220 or 230,000 men. We've already found pregnant women on the battlefield being shot at and in some cases killed. We found young boys and old men, people over the age of 50, people like me who have no business running around with a rifle on the battlefield. They are on the ropes. And remember, large quantities of cash have disappeared. You have officers at the top of the Ukrainian military who have failed to report the killed in action numbers. Because if you report the dead, then the widows and orphans of the people who are killed get a complete pension out of it. In other words, they're hugely beneficial or tied to the benefits from the state. So they don't report those that are killed, and instead they pocket the money themselves. This goes on at the brigade level, the battalion level, and even higher. When this war does end, I think the amount of money pilfered and stolen will shock people. Unfortunately, in the United States, where we have no sense of history, whatever happened 2 weeks ago is judged to be irrelevant, and we move down the road. The difference today is, of course, we face a serious financial crisis, and that may change everything ultimately for the United States. But for the moment, it has not yet struck with total ferocity, and so we continue to ignore the consequences. But Ukraine is finished. The nation is in ruins. Millions have left the country. I don't know if Ukraine as a nation will ever recover. And I think that's one of the reasons that you see BlackRock and many firms, agricultural firms and others from the West showing up in Ukraine to buy up as much of the fertile farmland as they can from Zelensky, who seems to be only too eager to sell it off. So I don't know what remains of Ukraine at this point. The Russians have not continued to advance because they already occupy the areas that are populated by Russians, either in spoken terms or ethnic terms or both. And these are the historic areas that the Russians have always talked about. These are the areas that Putin criticized Lenin for turning over to the Soviet bosses in Ukraine. So they're not really interested in advancing. The last thing they want is a war with the Baltic states or a war with Poland or anybody else. And so they are hoping against hope that there will be a negotiated settlement. But they've also made very clear that if no one will step forward, and I think the only people that could do this are in Europe, frankly, because we never will. If someone doesn't step forward to put an end to this and come to some sort of new arrangement, then he will continue to march to the west. How far? It's hard to tell, but I'm sure that Odessa, like Kharkov, will fall back into Russian hands, and it may be that he presses all the way to the river. But he's never wanted to go further. And the last thing that he wants is, of course, to destroy or harm or damage seriously Kiev, which is the equivalent of Jerusalem in Orthodox Christianity. So I don't know what to tell you, except that Europeans have to wake up, understand they've been lied to, and their leaders need to step forward and do what Washington will not. Of course, they're afraid of Washington because they, too, are under our financial thumb. But I think things have gotten so bad today in Germany, which was once the scientific industrial power of the world, or one of the top 2 or 3, is now fallen to 7th. And Russia has now risen to the top in Europe, largely because no one in the United States or the West ever bothered to point out that Russia has an abundance of resources, inexhaustible quantities of food, minerals, precious metals, commodities like oil and natural gas. And as a result, Russia can withstand things that many, many other countries cannot. That should have been evident to everyone during the Second World War, but for some reason we forgot about it. So now we're faced with a disaster in Ukraine, and we've turned our attention to cultivating another disaster in the Middle East. I'll be very surprised if a regional war there does not soon break out. On that happy note, I'll turn it back over to you, Glenn.
Yeah, you mentioned the very gruesome casualty numbers from Ukraine, and I find it interesting because in the media here we often get the impression that Russia's suffering huge numbers compared to Ukraine, that the casualty rate is definitely in Ukraine's favor. But again, it's quite strange because if one assesses the actual numbers, who has the most weaponry, the ammunition, the drones, the fighter jets, the electronic warfare, it's, these numbers don't lie. And what I also find shocking is if you visit these Ukrainian Telegram channels, they often have debates by Ukrainian soldiers where they warn you shouldn't underestimate the enemy. They have much better equipment, much better weapons. We delude ourselves, and it's quite dangerous.
Well, there's another point, Glenn, that's worth mentioning, and that is that the Ukrainians, unfortunately, were compelled to implement operations based on what I call the Anglo-American NATO model. That model hasn't changed much since the Second World War. And what the Russians have demonstrated is their understanding that things have changed dramatically since World War II, which is why they adopted the strategic defense and did as I outlined earlier. They've also built new rail lines, new railheads, so the logistical infrastructure necessary to support the volume of ammunition is also in place. We've let all of that atrophy for many, many years. And now I understand why, because people concluded there would be no war with Russia. Unfortunately, we picked a fight and we've got one. We should be interested in ending it because there is no need to spend most of our wealth on military power. That world is gone, thankfully, at least in the West. And we should recognize that and come to an arrangement with the Russians.
By the way, how much time do you have? I forgot to ask at the beginning.
Well, I was prepared to sit for 30 minutes. If you want me to go away, I'm happy to go away and drink coffee on my own.
We'll hold on to you for a little bit more then. Thank you. Well, you were citing these horrible casualty numbers, and I was wondering, where does the war go from here? Do you see a collapse in the future? If so, how will the West react? Will we escalate, or will we accept a defeat? Because again, I don't see any clear path forward. If anything, it seems like we haven't really planned for a plan B if we wouldn't be able to defeat Russia. So what do you see coming in the weeks or the months to come?
Well, the Ukrainian secret police, called the SBU, has behaved very much like the NKVD did under Stalin. Spent a lot of time murdering people and killing people behind the lines and shooting anyone who would not fight. People aren't aware of it, but during World War II, between 41 and 45, the NKVD shot and killed 1 million Soviet soldiers who refused to fight the Germans. So this is not new. This has worked thus far for Mr. Zelensky. The question is, how much longer can it work? I'm not sure it'll go on much longer. And I think what the effort is now is to maintain the facade of a government in Kiev to provide long-range strike weapons or tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles that can be used sort of as revenge attacks, attacking Russian towns and cities that are within range of Ukraine and killing as many civilians as possible. The Ukrainians were always quick to blame the Russians for everything they were doing. I think we're also going to find out that 90% of the so-called atrocities, and by the way, atrocities happen in every war, but 90% of the atrocities were committed by Ukrainians against the population and Russians and not the other way around. But again, that's not part of the narrative. People don't know that, and they have been taught to hate and despise Russians to the point where they're even incapable of believing that there could be anything good about the Russians. But I can tell you from having studied the orders and the directives that have come down from the Russian High Command, they've gotten very specific orders to avoid collateral damage. And that's a very difficult thing to do when your enemy moves into towns and villages and defends every house and every street, which is what the Ukrainians have done. But I think the Ukrainians have run out of manpower. And I think in the United States, as I pointed out, the narrative is increasingly exhausted, and everyone's turning their attention to the Middle East and Israel. So I think America is, quite frankly, prepared to let Ukraine die on its own, which is why I continue to tell Europeans, any who will listen, that their governments must step forward and they must take control. They must exercise some initiative. Sitting quietly, stupidly, and waiting for Washington to tell you what to do is a disaster. That's not an alliance. That's a dictatorship. And Washington always acts in its own interest. Sometimes it's not a good interest, but they think they're acting in their interest. You know, Charles de Gaulle said it best. When he was asked about NATO, he said, Europeans forget that Great Britain is an island and the United States and its population do not live in Europe. Hello, wake up. That's true. So start to think about your own interests. What is required? And we should be interested in peace, stability, and prosperity, you and we.
We've also been discussing the conflict in the Middle East, of course, after the Israel war with Gaza. You and I have spoken about this before as well. You very much predicted that this would be very difficult to contain. It would spread in different directions. And, well, sadly, these predictions have come true. I was just wondering, do you have any views on terms of how this war is developing from now on? And how this potentially clash with the media narrative?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, keep in mind that wars do spread, but they may not spread as rapidly as many think. I often refer to Americans as having the microwave mentality. If something doesn't happen immediately, then Americans walk away and say, well, it's not going to happen. People told me, in Ukraine that things would spread. And I said, why? And they said, well, the Russians are going to do this and that. And I said, no, the Russians aren't going to spread this war. They want to contain it. And they've exercised tremendous restraint in the face of almost no restraint from us. Now, in the Middle East, Israel is probably the only state other than the United States who is interested in a war. No one in the Middle East wants to go to war. Egypt doesn't want to go to war. Iran doesn't want to go to war. Turkey doesn't want to go to war. None of the Arabs in the Arab Peninsula do. But it's increasingly difficult to stay out because you cannot conceal the hundreds of thousands of lives that are being destroyed. In fact, you could probably up that number to well over 1 million now. You cannot tell a population to move to Rafah and Khan Yunis in Gaza near the Egyptian border because there it will be safe, and then attack those and kill at least 100 people every night in bombing attacks. I have always supported Israel. I know many people in the senior ranks, and I'm very much an admirer of them and many of the things they do. But this is a policy that we as Americans should not support. But we are supporting it because right now Mr. Netanyahu exercises far more influence over the conduct of our foreign and defense policy than Mr. Biden does. Mr. Netanyahu has everyone's ear. Again, the media is entirely on the side of Israel. Now, sometimes you'll see evidence for some criticism, but on the whole, the attitude is whatever happens, we've got to support Israel. The truth is that if we halted our support because the Israelis are continuing to kill large numbers of civilians in Gaza, the Israelis would run out of ammunition and support for their weapon systems in a matter of days. Some people say 2 weeks. Some have said 96 hours. We're not going to do that. As a result, you're in almost a World War I-like scenario in the sense that you have various actors who under normal circumstances might never cooperate, but they are now beginning to cooperate. When World War I broke out, Britain, that had historically been very hostile to Tsarist Russia, decided to work with Tsarist Russia against Germany that it regarded as its principal rival. We're seeing something similar happen between the Turks and the Iranians, and also with many of the Arabs. Mr. Erdogan was recently in Egypt. He held talks. They were at least popularly believed to be about oil and offshore gas and so forth in the Mediterranean and Libya. But there was also a discussion about what is happening in Gaza. And at the final exchange of remarks at the end in a press conference, General Sisi did not address Gaza, but Mr. Erdogan did and talked about the fact that it's unacceptable. I think that many of the people in the Middle East are hoping, against hope, that we will somehow or another impose some restraint on what's happening. Again, I don't see any evidence for that. I don't think that will happen. And so sometime beginning in April, May, and June, I think you're going to see the emergence of partners, strategic partners, who will take action against Israel. And given the fact that Israel is a very small country and they draw for their military on about 6 million people, I find it hard to believe that Israel will come out on the winning side in this kind of conflict. So don't fall into the American trap of microwave thinking. Stand by, be patient, because the worst, if we allow it to happen, will happen.
I know we're running out of time, but I thought I'll squeeze in one last question. As you know, this is an event in Norway, and during the Cold War, Norway attempted to strike a balance. We're members of NATO, so we have deterrence, but as we have a border with Russia, the idea was no foreign bases on our soil in order to deter, but not to provoke. A delicate balance. After the Cold War, we largely abandoned this. As you might have noticed, we're very eagerly sending weapons to fight the largest nuclear power in the world. And also, we're now going to open several military bases across the country, American military bases. Well, we don't call them military bases because we're not allowed to have military bases on our soil, which are foreign. So we call them, what do we call them? This is not a good word for it. We made one up. Anyways, I was just going to ask, how do you see, do you have any advice for us here in Norway?
I'm not in the habit of advising foreign powers. I would suggest that your audience consider what is happening in Finland and Sweden, because that's very important. They have borders close to your own. The Finns and the Swedes have made similar arrangements with the United States. There's a great deal of evidence that we are moving up towards the Arctic Circle for the purpose of establishing bases and potentially installing missiles that could range into Russia, that could conceivably carry nuclear warheads. I think this is both unnecessary and extremely dangerous. I always try to put myself in the shoes of the other side, and if I were Russian watching this, I would walk into the general staff and say, as much as it pains me to say so, we're going to have to deal with this. We have to find a way to counter it. So it's not just a question of what does Norway do. Your two neighbors have already taken steps which, in my judgment, are ill-advised and present you with a danger. Now, keep in mind, this is not an argument for disarmament. It's not an argument for, allying with Russia as opposed to us. My point is that the Russians do not want to live in the world that we are creating. They really don't. And the best evidence for it that I can find was the condition of Russian forces at the beginning of the current war. When they first went into Ukraine, there were actually very small numbers, no more than 90,000 combat troops. That is, troops that, I'm not talking about support troops, I'm not talking about artillery and strike weapons and so forth, but 90,000 combat troops went into eastern Ukraine. They were told not to shoot anybody unless they had to avoid killing Ukrainian forces. And when they first went in many areas, and you can see this on video footage if it hasn't all been destroyed, many of the Russians who had been badly treated by the Ukrainians came out to greet them. But when the Russians asked, what are you doing and where are you going? And they said, well, we're just coming in to compel the Ukrainians to live up to the Minsk Accords and come to a new arrangement. Well, the Russians said, well, the hell with you. If you're not coming in here to occupy and stay here, then you might as well leave, because as soon as you leave, the Ukrainian secret police will come and put bullets in all of our heads. So at the outset, they didn't have much support once it became clear that this was not designed to be a permanent annexation. All of this changed, but remember at the beginning, there were over 400,000 Ukrainian troops on hand. They were extremely well equipped and by NATO standards, well trained. The Russians did very well against them, but it became clear by June that if Russia was going to prevail, it had to have a much larger force. So if you look at the Russian armed forces today, their weapons, their equipment, their training, their leadership, and their capabilities, they owe much of this to the United States and its NATO allies. We created the compulsion for them to build the very force that we told everyone already existed, which did not. They have become the great power that everyone said we should fear, but did not then exist. So today, Russia, if it must respond to what's happening in Finland and Sweden, as well as Romania and other countries, it can do so. It doesn't want to. That's the important point. Because if the Russians really wanted to do those things, they would have advanced much more ruthlessly in Ukraine. Look at the difference between the way the Israeli armed forces have treated Gaza, parts of the West Bank, and are now preparing to treat southern Lebanon, and the way the Russians treated Ukraine. The Russians have moved deliberately and slowly and methodically, both to avoid casualties and to give people on the other side a chance to surrender, negotiate, reconsider. There was none of that in Israel because the Israelis wanted to destroy the population in Gaza, would like to do the same to the population of southern Lebanon and in the West Bank. They see that as an existential threat. The Russians do not see the Ukrainians as an existential threat, but they see NATO as a potentially existential threat. And now they're prepared to deal with that. So I would simply advise everyone in Oslo to stop listening to the drivel that comes out of Washington and then is repeated ad nauseum by Mr. Stoltenberg in Brussels. Start thinking for yourselves, because I don't think there is any reason or requirement for war with Russia, for you, for us, or for anybody else right now in Europe. But again, I hold the minority opinion.
So thank you so much for being so generous with your time. And yeah, I hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I love Norway. I love Scandinavia because I love fish. And I eat herring like it's going out of style. And whenever I come to visit, people look at me as though I should be locked up in an insane asylum. And they say, "Oh my God, how can you eat that?" I said, "Well, this is a big treat for me." And they said, "Oh, well, this is what we eat all the time." Okay, I understand that, but I really love the food. Also the people. I don't like the weather. So I wish you all the best.
If I may just make one final comment. The colonel, he mentioned it's always important to put yourself in the shoes of the other guy. And again, this is not just the military. This is what I tell students in international relations as well. It's the most important. You don't have to take their side, but you have to see it from their perspective. The main problem, as I tried to say before, when you have too much propaganda in the media, you criminalize this. You suggest that you're not allowed to say it from their perspective. And again, if this happens, then I think we already lost. So this is a great tragedy that we're not able to even explain it from the opposing side. So thank you again.